Afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Harris, the United Ways of Texas. We've spent today talking about funding and infrastructure, but as we all know, it takes more than just money to build broadband, right? It takes people, and I'm so glad Amanda could be joining us here today. We know that we need skilled workers who can build, maintain, and sustain this infrastructure. At United Ways of Texas, we also believe that it's a sector that creates high-quality jobs that we can grow locally and keep rooted in our communities. That's why I'm so excited to introduce this next session on the broadband workforce and what it really takes to prepare people for careers in this growing field. I'm so honored to introduce our speaker today, Amanda, Senior Fellow at the National Skills Coalition. She is a nationally recognized expert on workforce policy, adult education and skills training, and inclusive economic growth. Her work focuses on how we design systems that actually work for job seekers and also employers, particularly in these fast-growing industries like broadband and digital infrastructure. I have to say, before I pass it on to Amanda, that how valuable Amanda has been in my own policy and advocacy work. She's been a trusted resource as we work to address all barriers to connectivity at United Ways of Texas, beyond just infrastructure, but things like digital literacy, skills training, affordability, access to devices. She also was a thought partner when when the proposal for the Texas Broadband Development Office was coming to fruition, how we ensure that the state actually addresses all barriers to connectivity. So please join me in welcoming Amanda.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Kelty. And thank you, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I made everyone back home very envious with a photo of my lunch. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm on day 17 of this ludicrous cold laryngitis situation. I'm not contagious anymore, but I beg your pardon in advance for when I have to do a cough drop. All right. So let's talk about broadband workforce. I like to call this the chocolate chip cookie problem, which is everyone agrees that we need chocolate chip cookies, i.e. we need a workforce. And then everyone stares, and around the room we see flour and eggs and butter and sugar, and those are the ingredients for chocolate chip cookies. But there's a lot of intermediate steps between the ingredients and the cookies. And a lot of the workforce conversations that I've been a part of, folks are kind of assuming the intermediate steps, right? We want those cookies. They smell great coming out of the oven. So what I'm going to do today is walk through some of those intermediate steps and talk about what some of your peers and, yes, your competitors in other parts of the country are doing to kind of tackle some of these issues. So now let me make sure I am controlling this thing appropriately. Come on. Clicker? Oh, there it is. I see it. Okay. Yeah. I got it. Okay. We can do that one. Even better. Okay. So what are we going to talk about? We are going, just briefly, National Skills Coalition is a big tent bipartisan coalition, about 20,000 workforce and education advocates, so folks who work at community colleges, workforce boards, nonprofit organizations, adult education providers, immigrant serving organizations, digital skills providers, labor unions, chambers of commerce, really anyone with an interest in making sure that workers have the skills they need to get good jobs and that small businesses can find the skilled workforce they need. So it is my job all day, every day, to think about what kind of public policies and local partnerships can make those things happen. And that's why I've been asked to join you all here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the task is. What does it mean to create a broadband workforce? We're going to talk about what's possible, and I'm going to share some new research from my organization in which we interviewed both businesses and workers about the process of helping people train for new jobs, and then talk a bit about what's next. So let's talk about the task, right? It is not news to anyone that this work is happening in an uncertain economic landscape, right? We have things going on with tariffs. We have things going on with data centers. We have things going on with the stock market. We have things going on with the literal weather outside. There's a lot that's uncertain. And so part of what I want you to leave here today knowing is that I am absolutely not here to tell you that there's a magic bullet answer. First of all, different regions of Texas need different things. I would be a fool to suggest to you that the challenges in El Paso look exactly like the challenges in Dallas. I've been to both places. I know that's not true, right? But secondly, I would also be a fool if I parachuted in here and I was like, well, here's your perfect list of answers, and if you do these exact steps, you'll come out with perfect chocolate chip cookies every time. Because guess what? Humans are not a recipe, right? We are more complicated than that, and also we're more fun than that. So, it's a mixed blessing. There are, though, some tried and true practices and tools that folks all over the country have used when they have tried to tackle exactly this kind of challenge, right? Here's an influx of federal funding. Here's a big North Star goal that we're all trying to get to, which is how do we get more high-speed internet into communities? And then how do we make sure that we have the skills and the humanity to make that actually happen, right? And anybody who's ever waited for someone to come to their home to install high-speed internet knows that at the end of the day, that is a human relationship, right? In the last apartment I lived in, I ended up spending a rather ridiculous amount of time with the cable company person who came, and I learned how to fish a line through the wall of my building to locate where the mini cable was that we could sort of thread it through, and boy, did I get an education that day. That was a lot of fun, but at the end of the day, I did finally get internet, which was probably the most important thing. All right, let's talk about data. Some of you are like, oh, good, this is my favorite part, and some of you are like, oh, wow, this is really where the afternoon nap would be great. So I want to talk about two kinds of data. The first kind is quantitative data, right? The facts, the figures, the numbers, right? You saw Catherine DeWitt here earlier. The team at Pew has been amazing at putting out terrific analysis. You have local government officials here in Texas who are great at this. You have your state data agency. The challenge in trying to come up with quantitative data about, well, we're going to need 50,000 construction workers and 11,000 line workers. It is a moving target, and it is not a standardized system, right? And so if you're challenged, or if you feel like you've been hearing very contradictory numbers from different people, you're not crazy, right? Because the numbers really come down to which choices you're making about things. Are you counting locators as a separate job category from folks who are, trenchers? Are you counting broadband tower technicians as different from fiber optic technicians? Are you we could go on all day with the minutia of that. What I hope you take away from this is that there are two kinds of data, and while there is excellent quantitative data out there, one of the most important kinds of data you have is qualitative data, right? And I have two guys standing here talking because as unfancy as this looks, this is one of the most effective ways to gather ground-level intelligence about what is actually needed. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about interviews I did earlier last year with 75 business owners about skills and credentials, and sort of, again, talk to you about what are those intermediate steps? What do they look like when, okay, so Amanda says conversations are important and qualitative data is important. What does that even mean? What do I go home and do on Monday? We're going to talk about that, but don't underestimate the value of having those hallway conversations, showing up at your chamber breakfast at 7:30 in the morning, showing up at your local Rotary Club or United Way or whatever partner organization you may be engaging with. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a minute, but I want to go through this sort of high-level stuff first. An ecosystem of partners. So the Fed and Texas Rural Funders did a fabulous job of getting a diversity of folks in the room here today, right? Bankers and ISPs and nonprofits and you name it. The challenge, and particularly in a state like Texas, the challenge is not that you all have to be working towards exactly the same goal or rowing in exactly the same direction, but you at least have to be aligned. And alignment can be tricky when you're dealing with something that is less well-defined, right? If I told you right now that we were talking about training more nurses, I'm pretty sure that I could get most of the room to raise their hand if I asked if you know a nurse, if you know where somebody in your family would go if they wanted to train to be a nurse, if you knew approximately how much they'd have to pay in tuition, if you had a sense of the kind of job they'd be likely to get when they graduated. You know all that. But guess what? For broadband, we don't always know that, And that is a challenge when it comes to building that ecosystem of partners, right? Because if I want to build an ecosystem of partners for a nurse pipeline, it's tricky, it's hard. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's, a piece of cake. But at least I can say, well, I want the academic folks who are doing the training, and I want the hospitals where folks can do practicums, and I want some nursing homes for folks who aren't going to work in hospitals, and I want folks who can help them study for the NCLEX exam, and on and on. There's also shared resources. So Ohio, our friends in Ohio made a big, bold bet with their governor early on. And I'm seeing Anna here, so you should go find Anna from Broadband, Ohio, if you want to go bend her ear and talk about Ohio after this. And they basically said, look, we are going to make a statewide bet on workforce development for broadband in Ohio. And they really acted early before BEAD funds were in hand with some state funding to get the ball rolling to say, okay, are we going to have one standardized curriculum that will be distributed through community colleges? Will we have a list of career pathways on a website that people can look at to understand what would my career path look like in this industry? Now, Ohio is struggling now, as many states are, because of the uncertainty over the BEAD non-deployment funding. So I'm not here to tell you that this is a beautiful, rainbow sparkly story in which everything turns out perfectly. But what I will say is when you have a governor or another state level official who says, okay, I'm putting my thumb on the scale, I'm saying this is important, I'm going to convene people, and I don't want you all to reinvent the wheel separately in your own regions of the state. I want to give you some standardized resources and then let you implement at the local level in ways that do reflect your local specifics. That is a good practice, and you ought to be borrowing that from your friends in Ohio. And Texas has done that in other contexts, right? So this is not new news to Texas. The Texas Workforce Commission has really been a national leader in many respects with regard to some other industries in this kind of workforce approach. Creative use of existing infrastructure. Right? So what do I mean by that? I actually don't mean roads and bridges. This is just the most fun picture I could find to illustrate it and to keep you all awake at 3:30 in the afternoon. So think of infrastructure not only as your local community or technical college system, your 4 years, your workforce centers, but also think about it as the human infrastructure, right? Who are the people in your community who are really smart and thoughtful about thinking about the connections and training pipelines, right? Did somebody in your community get really creative a few years ago when you had a new industry come to town and figure out, okay, how do we create the training pipeline for that industry? That person may not know anything about high-speed internet, but they do know something about workforce training, and so how do you borrow that, right? You may have folks who worked on collective impact projects. Maybe they worked on how foster care youth aging out of the system need to find career paths. Maybe they worked on, something completely different. Find those people and think about those people as part of your infrastructure. And then braided funding, right? We got the BEAD funding, we got all the digital equity funding, then a lot of that got rolled back, everyone's uncertain, things have changed under different administrations, but for many of us, the reality of this work for a long time has always been that there is more than one funding source that we have to tap into and more than one way to approach this. And I'm going to talk about some specific examples of that in a minute. But these are kind of the high-level ingredients, right, for our chocolate chip cookies, right? We want our data, we want our ecosystem of partners, we want that braided set of funding, we want that existing infrastructure that we're tapping into. Those are all the puzzle pieces that we are going to need to start to put together in order to make sure that there's enough of a workforce when we need there to be one. But I want to touch on one more thing, and I don't have a slide for it because it's really something that coalesced as I was listening to people talk this morning. If I tell you right now that we need more truck drivers, you're probably going to nod and be like, yeah, I've seen that in the news. And if I tell you that a lot of people get their CDLs, their commercial driver's licenses, right, you're going to nod and be like, yeah, probably my buddy, my brother-in-law, my cousin, somebody has one, right? And then if I tell you an awful lot of people leave the commercial trucking industry every year, you're going to be like, yeah, long-haul trucking, it's exhausting, you're away from your family, I can see that. part of the challenge with any workforce pipeline is making sure people have a realistic sense in advance of what they're signing up for. So over across the border in Louisiana, some of you may have heard Josh Etheridge talk about this, but he talks about when he is bringing folks in to his company as entry-level workers, he wants them to have a real sense of the stakes, right? You're going to be out in the physical world. You're going to be impacted by weather. You're going to be working at these kinds of hours. You're going to be working under these kinds of conditions, not to scare them off, but to give them a realistic perception of what that job is going to be like. And you know what? There are people who stay in long-haul trucker drives for their whole careers. They love it. There's a million things they could tell you that they love about that job. So I'm not here to tell you that every person who's out of work in Texas ought to be shunted into a broadband career. I think, as we all know, as my lovely former boss used to say, that is the road to no town, right? We're not going to do the road to no town by shunting a whole bunch of people into a career for which it might not really be a reasonable fit. But the more practical and tangible we can be for people about both, hey, look, these are the real conditions you're going to be working under. Are you okay with this? Are you signing up for this? But also the fun and the joy of it, right? Some people like a different situation to solve every day, right? They hate the thought of being in a warehouse or being at an office and doing the same task repetitively. If you tell them, hey, you're going to be at a different geographic location all the time, you're going to be dealing with new customers all the time, new people, that can be energizing, right? But being thoughtful about the human component of creating a workforce pipeline, it is not just about looking at numbers on paper and saying, well, we have X number of Texans who are this age, who are out of work, they ought to be grateful to get this job because it pays this much money. They ought to be grateful, but you know what? Have you met humans? We don't behave as we ought. That's not how humans work, right? And so really thinking about, if I were sitting with my favorite teenager and talking to them about a career in this industry, or if I were sitting with my laid-off brother-in-law and talking to him about making a pivot and a career change in his 30s or his 40s, what's the story I'd be telling, and what other data or partners do I need to make that a compelling story? Okay, so I want to talk now about sort of some more practical examples and ideas, right? Getting more concrete. With my colleagues, I did a couple of reports last year, one in which we interviewed 75 small businesses, another in which we spoke with about 35 workers and students. When we talk to small businesses, we ask them a series of questions about like, hey, how are you assessing skills and credentials when you're hiring people? What does that look like? We found that about 20% of the businesses we talked to had a cohesive set of strong hiring practices. And they did not use phrases like job quality or high road employment or other terms that workforce leaders often throw around. What they said was, we want to be an employer of choice in our local community. So we heard earlier in the panel, oh, look for the good actors who could be your ISP partners. Look for the good actors who could be your financing partners. You want to look for the employers who are the good actors who want to be the employers of choice, because they're the ones who've done the homework to actually lay out, what skills am I hiring for? How will I know if this person has them? And that's particularly important exactly because broadband jobs are not nursing jobs, right? There's not one list of skills and one credential that everyone can point to and say, this is the thing that we need. So what are the things that leading businesses have in common as we spoke with them? Clear, standardized job descriptions with well-defined skills and competencies. And you're all sitting there going, good grief, that sounds like table stakes. It does sound like table stakes, and I am sad to report that not everyone has table stakes. So that is a question. If you are a community college or a four-year university person sitting here and you're trying to decide which employer partner you should collaborate with, if they don't have this in place, they're not in a good position to be a partner for you, right? If you're a local council of government officials person sitting here and you're trying to think through how do we become a good employer in the broadband space, or how do we identify which ISP might be meaningful, these are some traits to look for in an employer. some kind of meaningful connection to an education and workforce system, that can look really different, right? So in some parts of Texas, that might be they have a great relationship with their local community education program serving adult students at their K-12 school, right? In other parts of Texas, that might be a connection to a community college or a workforce solution center or who knows what. But there's some kind of connection. That employer takes some opportunities to connect with their peers in the industry. You can talk to a lot of employers who say things like, there's a labor shortage or hiring is hard. But when you scratch the surface, they mean different things by that. I talked to people who told me, straight to my face, turnover rates that would make your hair stand on end if I told you, and they were tolerating it as normal because they thought that level of churn was normal. And it's not. And one of the ways you get to that is by talking to your peers and saying, so we're hiring a bunch of locators, and we're finding that, we're having a 20% quarterly turnover. 20% of your folks are leaving in 90 days? Something is wrong with the front of your pipeline, right? So you want to be partnering with those businesses that are asking those questions and talking to their peers about them. Number 4 is kind of a fun one. Every employer we talked to said soft skills were important. But then when you scratch the surface, the leading employers, the 20% of leading employers, they didn't mean soft skills like, people need to cover up their tattoos and pull up their pants and other kinds of superficial sort of compliance-oriented. They meant interpersonal skills, teamwork, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, right? I had one guy I talked to who said, look, we're in a lean manufacturing environment. We do Gembas, which are walkthroughs. It's part of our quality improvement process. I need every employee in my company, including the janitor, to be comfortable taking the microphone and talking in front of his coworkers, his boss, and me as CEO about how the janitor's closet is organized and whether we need to change that to make the company, more efficient and productive, right? So this may seem far removed from broadband. It is not far removed from broadband. You do not want to hire a company that's doing locator services and things like that is focused on the wrong kind of interpersonal skills. You want to hire the kind that understands that the interpersonal skills that really matter is, can one person speak to another person on the team to say, hey, you're about to hit a gas line, in a way that other person can hear them and avoid doing it, right? That's much more important than whether they're wearing long sleeve shirts that cover up their tattoos or not. And I'm giving you that goofy example, and you're going to think, good grief, Amanda, why are you giving me these examples of things that sound so wildly unrealistic? And I am sad to report to you that there are companies for whom the long sleeves matter more than the interpersonal skills. And those are not the actors you want to be partnering with in workforce training. Okay, robust feedback loop. This sounds really amorphous and confusing. All I really mean here is any employer partner that you might be wanting to work with should have some mechanism for workers to flag if something's going wrong and know that they won't be punished for it, right? Or an idea for something that could be done better and know that they won't be punished for it. And then a collaborative approach to solving common work-life challenges. What I mean here is stuff like childcare and transportation, right? This is Texas. I know there's a lot of regions of the state where public transit is essentially invisible or completely absent, right? So transportation doesn't just mean a train line or a bus line. It means other kinds of support. And when we're thinking about a workforce, and particularly when we're thinking about a workforce in rural areas, it's not the responsibility of any one provider in the workforce and education ecosystem to figure out how to solve the problem that, when folks get their first job after returning from incarceration, or when folks get their first job out of college, their car might break down because maybe they don't have a very reliable car at this point. It is your job to figure out who's the organization or the entity in your community that's working on solving this, and can they be part of your Rolodex of partners, your ecosystem of people you can connect with. It is not your responsibility to solve childcare. It is not your responsibility to solve transportation. But it is your responsibility to have a finger on the pulse of who in your community is solving those challenges. So again, when we think about, we need a broadband workforce, part of this question is, okay, a significant chunk of those workers are going to be parents of kids under 18 and often parents of kids under 5. So what does it mean to create training programs and career pathways that acknowledge that people are 360-degree humans? You're not going to need to have on-site child care for fiber optic technicians. That's probably wildly unrealistic in almost every circumstance, right? But having an understanding of what are the puzzle pieces in my community that I can put in place for people is actually incredibly important. We also, when we interviewed these 75 small businesses, they told us, look, people put a lot of credentials on their resumes, and half the time I don't know what those credentials are, and they don't really mean very much to me, right? Maybe they know what an OSHA 10 certification is, an OSHA 30 certification. Maybe they know what other certain certificates or two-year degrees from local colleges might look like. But a lot of times, particularly if it's from a third party, they don't know. So thinking from your perspective, again, putting together these ingredients to make the cookies, can the students and workers you're working with have a one-sentence explanation of here's the credential I've earned and here's how it's relevant to this kind of role? And then do your own staff and your own partner organizations have a one-sentence explanation? If somebody's earning a mechatronics degree, is that relevant for a fiber optic role? Can they explain if it is relevant for a fiber optics role, right? So it's not that you have to have every answer to this question in your brain to be able to answer it for every possible, engineering or computer science or construction-related job that might fall under that big umbrella of broadband jobs. But you do want to be able to help folks think in creative ways that just because it doesn't say the word broadband doesn't mean that that credential doesn't relate to broadband jobs, right? And you want to give them the language and the vocabulary to be able to explain that. So some key takeaways from employers. This is going to come as a surprise to zero of you. All of them said, book learning is great, but I greatly value workers who also have some hands-on experience. So when you're thinking about job training programs, whether it's in-person or virtual, you want to make sure there's some kind of hands-on learning component. Maybe apprenticeship, maybe a practicum, maybe externship, maybe internship, maybe some other kind of work-based learning. Whatever it is, that will have a higher return on investment for you as a local government leader, for you as a workforce advocate, for you as a business who's trying to get a pipeline of people who are going to not quit on you, right? If their training program replicates the real-life conditions of what their job is going to be like, guess what? That is terrific preparation for people being like, okay, this is for me. And not only is this for me, but my cousin, he loves this kind of stuff. Now I'm going to have him come to the training program, and guess what? Now you've got word of mouth doing your recruiting, which is so much cheaper than every other kind of recruiting you could be trying to do, right? And I know this room was a bit divided this morning when we talked about, is there a broadband worker shortage or is it a coordination problem? The real answer is yes and, right? Yes, there's a shortage. Yes, there's a coordination problem, and there's also other factors. We also heard over and over again that upskilling of first-line supervisors is really important. How many of you have heard the saying, people don't quit their jobs, they quit their managers, right? You don't quit your job, you quit your boss. It is not helpful if we train a whole bunch of people for broadband careers and then they quit because their frontline supervisor is some person who was great at the technical part of the job and then got promoted and doesn't have the people skills, the interpersonal skills to be great at the people management part of the job. Again, this sounds a little fuzzy and probably a little ambiguous and confusing, but if the problem you're trying to solve is I need to be able to have a crew to go out there to dig and install fiber lines in all kinds of weather, you need them to have a supervisor that folks trust. And you can't have a supervisor with a turn rate of everybody leaving in the first 90 days, right? And so when you think about workforce challenges, nobody in this room has to be responsible for solving all of the things that I'm highlighting, but I want you, again, to be thinking about the fact that these are intermediate steps, and people all over the country have solved different parts of these intermediate steps. So on that example before around work-based learning, I talked before about Apprenticeship Carolina in South Carolina. On childcare, Mississippi ended up using some of their TANF funds, their Temporary Assistance for Needy Families funds, to support childcare for women apprentices. Right here in Texas, in Socorro, down in El Paso, there's a terrific program that supports adults who are earning their GED or high school equivalency, but are also in a training program to become an electrician, right? And so they pay the high school career technical education teachers overtime to work in the evening with the adult learners, and the adults are earning not just the high school diploma or equivalent, but also on this pre-apprenticeship track that takes them into an apprenticeship track to become an electrician. And guess what? Electricians are a broadband job, right? So there are models of how folks have successfully approached this, and you don't have to reinvent or start from scratch on any of this. All right, I'm going to do a quick time check and also do a quick cough drop check. Okay, we're good. Industry sector partnerships. Some of you are part of these, some of you have never heard of them. This is a group of 6 to 12 employers in the same industry who get together to talk about their talent pipeline issues. And some of you are like, competitors talking honestly about their talent needs? That sounds very far-fetched. I am here to tell you that this model can work really, really well. Pennsylvania does it well with a set of industry partnerships. There are some individual ones here in Texas that have been terrific, although at the state level, Texas hasn't invested at the same level as some other states. I know it is the kiss of death in Texas to mention our friends to the far west, but I will tell you that California has done this well. And I think more importantly, you know, Washington State, Colorado, and Georgia. Georgia has done some really good industry sector partnerships as well. So this is a problem that your friends in other parts of the country have started to solve. And I talked before about the confusion that small businesses have about credentialing, and I'm not going to kind of belabor that point. Okay, so that was the business side. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the worker piece. Because again, when we're talking about the challenge of how do we have enough of a broadband workforce, part of it is also what assumptions are we making about who's looking for a job and what their current circumstances are. Right? So we interviewed these 35 workers who had been through some kind of shorter-term credential training program, i.e., the target audience who might be appropriate for many kinds of broadband-related job training, right? And we asked them, why did you enroll, right? First answer is very straightforward, right? I wanted a better job. I wanted a brighter future. And about 20% of folks also said, I want to set a good example for my children, which I thought was really lovely and not necessarily something we had anticipated. So that's why they enroll. They're also really frustrated with a lot of what they're encountering in the labor market, right? They might be working in retail or food service or had other kinds of gig work where they're kind of bouncing around. They want something real. They've applied for jobs and feel like AI screens them out before a human ever sees their resume because they get rejected 5 seconds after they apply at 1 o'clock in the morning. They get unbelievable numbers of ghost jobs and scams that are on Craigslist or Indeed or any other platform you can imagine, right? So that's the universe of people for whom broadband training might be a great potential next step, right? But do they even know about broadband careers? People are picking training options not always based on what we would hope they would pick, right? They choose things that can fit their schedule because most people can't afford to quit their jobs and go through training, and that are flexible and affordable, right? Maybe they've got kids, so like, I'll do an online training program from home. But remember what we talked about before. Employers value that hands-on experience. If you just do an online training program and it has no hands-on component, that is not going to be as valuable to you in the labor market, right? And people want to know if the training program they're signing up for is actually going to pay off for them. They want to know how many people graduate from it and what kind of salaries do they earn. But often that data can be hard to find. So again, if you're thinking, well, gosh, how am I going to make this happen in my rural community where we just don't have that many workers to begin with, one thing you should be thinking about is how do I make outcome data available so that people can see what it is they will get if they pursue this kind of training. Okay. So what did people get out of the training programs they went through? And we talked to people who went through the whole spectrum of training programs, right? Digital marketing jobs and IT jobs and solar panel installation jobs and manufacturing jobs and you name it. They definitely gained skills and they gained confidence, but a third of people told us, hey, I went through a training program and it didn't actually get me to the job I wanted. It didn't even get me a job at all in a lot of cases, right? So this is also part of the landscape that you all have to navigate in figuring out how do we crack this broadband workforce problem, right? People have been burned before. Maybe they have debt from having tried to pursue education before, or maybe they're just really discouraged because they thought this program would be the thing that changed everything for them, and it just wasn't. So guess what? This is not a surprise. Remember this slide? You saw it in the business section too. The people who went through training programs who had actually found jobs that were a fit for them and did help them earn decent salaries and support their families, guess what? Their training program had a real partnership with an employer and had some kind of work-based learning or hands-on component, right? So you probably feel like I'm belaboring this point at this point, which I kind of am, but I really want you to go home tonight and say, book learning alone is not enough. Campus alone is not enough. We got to have some on-site and hands-on components in order for folks to get real results. Now, this is the last finding from our research, which might sound bad from a broadband perspective, right? Highly regulated fields like healthcare were more likely to lead to employment. For all the same reasons that I said at the beginning when we talked about nurses, right? Employers know what the credential is. If you put it on your resume, they're going to recognize it. They know what the skills that are associated with that credential generally are. We're not there yet completely when it comes to broadband. So we really do need to give people the tools to communicate, hey, I earned a credential. What does this credential even mean? It's awarded by a third party. It's based on a rigorous exam. It requires 2,000 hours of instruction. Whatever it might be, we need to communicate what it actually entails. So, takeaways. Making sure people have access to high-quality programs without significant out-of-pocket costs. And some of you are sitting here thinking, well, Amanda, what's happening with the BEAD non-deployment money? NTIA is having a listening session today, and I hope that some of you have colleagues or staff members who were part of that listening session to give NTIA an earful to say, hey, remember how Congress said you should be allowed to use this non-deployment money on things like workforce development? Please, let us use this non-deployment money on things like workforce development. Incentivize and subsidize more work-based learning opportunities, build those strong partnerships with business, and make that program outcome data as practical and accessible as possible, right? If you want to go and buy a consumer product, there are online review sites everywhere. You can go to Consumer Reports. You can go to Wirecutter on the New York Times website. You can go to Amazon and read product reviews. Now, there's buyer beware and all of those, and all of us have the experience of having seen fake reviews, right? But there are a million reviews for any consumer product that you can possibly imagine buying. You know what there isn't? There isn't this same kind of dashboard for all different kinds of workforce training programs. And there are individual institutions and states that have been working to try to improve this landscape, but we aren't there yet. So you can differentiate your community and your institution by actually providing that. And then supportive services, I talked a little bit already about this, so I'm not going to belabor that. Okay, I want to talk now about one more puzzle piece of funding, not because I think any of you are higher ed financing experts, and goodness knows you don't need to become one in the next 10 minutes. But before I wrap up, I just want you to be aware of a good thing that is happening for Texas that was in the bill that Congress passed last summer. So this is H.R. 1, the big budget reconciliation bill that passed last summer. Billions of dollars in additional Pell Grant funding were made available in that legislation. This funding is called Workforce Pell, or sometimes short-term Pell. And it is available to eligible institutions who are enrolling eligible students in eligible programs. What do we mean by that, and how does broadband fit into it, right? So institutions must be accredited under the Higher Education Act and able to receive federal student financial aid. Plain and simple, what that mostly means is colleges, right? There's a handful of nonprofit organizations that are accredited this way, but it's almost always going to be something that you would recognize as a college or university. Students must meet standard Pell eligibility requirements. Generally speaking, Pell is designed for lower income students, for example. There are also requirements around things like immigration status. You have to be a U.S. citizen, a permanent resident or green card holder, or somebody who has refugee or asylee status in order to be eligible for Pell. One thing that is different in this new Pell funding, though, is that generally speaking, the federal government says you can't get Pell if you've already earned a bachelor's degree, because the idea is you don't need 2 bites at the apple. But because Workforce Pell is intended to help you get this short-term career training that might happen for some people in mid-career when they're in their 30s or 40s or even 50s and they're pivoting into a different industry, you actually can access Workforce Pell even if you've already earned a bachelor's degree. So keep that in mind, again, as you're thinking about the people in your community and the pipeline of workers. I'm not going to go through this whole slide here, but long story short, these are programs that are between 8 to 15 weeks long and 150 to 600 clock hours. So some of you know, for example, in Louisiana, there's a community college program helping train folks at a sheriff's office who are reentering the community after having been incarcerated as fiber optic technicians. That's an example of the kind of partnership that is about creating a new pipeline of workers into an in-demand broadband-related field. And that community college is an example of the kind of institution that would be eligible to receive this new Workforce Pell funding. It becomes available this coming July for the upcoming academic year. And again, I'm not going to belabor the ins and outs of higher ed funding. As I wrap up here, I want to just get concrete for a second. I've thrown a lot of information at you. I've thrown stories. I've thrown examples. I hope you walk out of the room here with a couple of big takeaways in your mind. The first is, this is a process that has a bunch of intermediate steps, and there's no one magic bullet that can get you a broadband workforce tomorrow, right? It's also a process that requires different partners to carry out the different steps. So you should not be walking out of here feeling like your organization or the entity that you represent has to be responsible for all those intermediate steps. Please don't walk away with that perception. And then finally, I do want you to walk away with the responsibility that you should be talking to the people in your community who are responsible for the other intermediate steps. That is something you are responsible for and that I hope you will take and run with. Many of you are already doing it. Many of you are here because you are committed to doing that. So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But if you walk out of this room today, I want you to remember this is a process. Other people have done this process. You don't have to reinvent it from scratch. It has lots of steps. You don't have to do all the steps. You do need to know who else in your community is doing different steps. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all so much for your attention in a windowless room at the end of the day. Very generous of you, very kind. I will be around today at the reception, but also tomorrow. So please feel free to come chat. And if you have cool stuff that you're doing that you want to brag about, I would love to hear it. Because there's nothing more fun for me than being able to go to California and tell them that Texas is doing something that they should really catch up on. I'm sure you all support that. Thank you all so much. Kelty, I don't know if somebody wants to announce the last Evan, maybe. Okay. I know there's the posters.